I was a good husband. Then I crossed one line I couldn't undo.
I didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray my wife. That would have required honesty. What I did instead was far more efficient. I explained my behavior so thoroughly to myself that it stopped feeling like betrayal at all. At least, not in the dramatic sense people imagine. No shouting, no secret hotels, no visible collapse. Just a series of small permissions I granted myself, one after another, until the damage was already irreversible. On paper, I was a good husband. I didn't drink too much. I didn't disappear for days. I had a stable job, a predictable routine, and no visible vices. I remembered birthdays. I showed up to family gatherings. I listened, or at least paused long enough to look attentive. If marriage were evaluated like a quarterly performance review, I would have scored meets expectations across the board. And that should have been reassuring. Instead, it became dangerous. Comfort dulls self-examination. It convinces you that nothing being wrong is the same as everything being right. Over time, stability starts to feel like proof of love, even when love has quietly shifted into maintenance. You stop asking questions because the system appears functional. I told myself that was maturity. I wasn't unhappy. That's important. I wasn't miserable or desperate or fantasizing about escape. I didn't feel trapped. I just felt unchallenged, unobserved, like a background process running smoothly enough to ignore. Instead of asking myself why, I found something that distracted me from the question entirely. It started at work, not because work is romantic, but because it's repetitive. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity lowers defenses. Conversations that began about deadlines drifted into complaints. Complaints turned into jokes. Jokes turned into shared observations that didn't need explanation. Nothing physical, nothing explicit, just attention. I told myself it was harmless because it hadn't crossed any technical boundaries. No touching, no declarations, no confessions whispered at the wrong hour. I hid behind definitions the way insecure people hide behind rules. Hyper-logical people are very good at that. The first lie I told myself was simple. This doesn't change how I feel about my wife. The second was more dangerous. I'm still in control. The third was almost impressive in its confidence. I can stop whenever I want. That last one is practically a cliché, which should have been a warning. But clichés only look obvious from the outside. From the inside, they feel personal, rational, earned. I didn't notice when I stopped mentioning my wife in conversations. I didn't notice when I started checking my phone more carefully. I didn't notice when certain messages felt slightly more important than they should have. What I noticed was how easy it all felt. No alarms, no guilt attacks, just a smooth internal narrative that explained everything before doubt had a chance to form. I wasn't replacing my wife, I told myself. I was just expanding my emotional bandwidth. That very phrasing should have disqualified me from adult relationships. But it worked. For a while. And by the time I realized something fundamental had shifted, I had already crossed a line quietly enough that turning back would have required a kind of courage I hadn't yet developed. Once the line was crossed, the rules changed. Not officially, just internally. I stopped asking whether something was right or wrong and started asking whether it was manageable. That shift alone should have terrified me. Instead, it felt practical. I wasn't living a double life in the theatrical sense. There were no disguises, no sudden personality shifts. I was the same person in both places. That was the problem. I didn't feel split. I felt streamlined. I learned quickly how to lie without lying.
I didn't invent stories. I edited them. I shortened sentences. I removed unnecessary details. I answered questions accurately, just not completely. Technically honest, emotionally fraudulent. Secrecy didn't make me anxious. It made me efficient. I started placing my phone face down without thinking. Started timing replies. Started categorizing conversations by risk level. I wasn't hiding from my wife. I was managing exposure. There's a difference, and it matters more than people admit. Guilt showed up in strange ways, not as remorse, not as panic, as irritation. Every normal question felt invasive. Every check-in felt like surveillance. When my wife asked how my day was, I heard subtext that didn't exist. When she noticed small changes in my behavior, I interpreted concern as accusation. I resented her for being close enough to notice. That's the part I still have trouble admitting. At some point, I started justifying my behavior preemptively. I told myself I was still present, still providing, still committed in all the ways that mattered. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't choosing anyone over her. I was just containing a private variable. I even congratulated myself for it. That's what hyper-rationalization does. It turns restraint into virtue. It reframes damage control as morality. But systems like that don't fail loudly. They fail quietly, through friction, through fatigue, through tiny inconsistencies that accumulate until someone who trusts you starts paying closer attention. She noticed my phone first, not the messages, the way I handled it, the way I angled the screen, the way I paused before setting it down. Micro hesitations are very visible to people who know you well. Then she noticed the absence, the way certain names stopped appearing in conversation, the way I became selectively vague about my schedule, the way I answered quickly, as if speed could replace sincerity. She didn't accuse me. She observed. That was worse. The night everything surfaced wasn't dramatic. No confrontation at the door, no shouting across rooms. Just a quiet moment when she asked if there was something I needed to tell her. I said no. And that's the moment I still replay. Because it wasn't fear that made me lie. It was confidence. Confidence that I could still control the narrative, that I had time, that disclosure was optional. I was wrong. She already knew enough, not everything, just enough to understand that the version of me she was speaking to was incomplete. When she finally named it, the thing I had been carefully avoiding, it didn't feel like exposure. It felt like gravity returning. The room went quiet in a way that wasn't empty, but full. Full of things I had postponed saying. Full of consequences I had delayed calculating. Full of the sudden realization that my logic had only worked as long as no one else was allowed to apply it. She asked me to explain. I did what I always do when I feel cornered. I started with structure, with sequences, with cause and effect. I spoke calmly, evenly, as if clarity of language could substitute for clarity of intention. It didn't work. She listened without interrupting, not because she agreed, but because she was measuring something. The distance between what I said and what she felt. The gap was wider than I expected. Then she asked a question I hadn't optimized for. Why didn't you protect us? That question didn't fit into any framework I had built. It couldn't be answered with logic, because logic was the tool I had used to avoid responsibility in the first place. And in that moment, something finally became clear. I hadn't cheated because I was unhappy. I hadn't cheated because my wife failed me. I had cheated because I stopped holding myself accountable for my internal state. I wanted novelty to fix boredom. attention to fix insecurity, desire to fix self-doubt. I outsourced emotional regulation to someone who didn't owe me anything and called it chemistry. That isn't love. That's consumption. Our marriage didn't end with a dramatic conclusion. It ended with erosion, with trust wearing down quietly, grain by grain, until there was nothing solid left to stand on. There was no explosion, just distance, spreading calmly and permanently. I used to believe loyalty is something you feel when conditions are right, when you're fulfilled, when you're seen. I was wrong. Loyalty is a decision you make when your emotions stop being convenient, when no one is watching, when rationalizations are easy and consequences are abstract. I don't tell this story to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I tell it because if you believe love alone prevents betrayal, you're already exposed. Love doesn't protect relationships. Responsibility does. So here's the question I wish I had asked myself before everything quietly collapsed, and the one I'll leave you with. When you say you love someone, are you choosing them or just choosing not to be alone?